Hello, everybody. Welcome to Remaking the Table. This is the third installment in a webinar series produced by SFU's Community Engaged Research Initiative, also known as CERi. And today we're exploring the intersections between cultural sensitivity and community engaged research. My name is Jackie Wong, and I work with CERi on community initiatives. I am so delighted to facilitate this conversation today. This is a vast, ongoing space of learning that's really close to my heart, and I'm super honored to do this today with our guests, the co-founders of Bảo Vệ Collective, which is a group that I've had the pleasure of watching grow since its founding a little over a year ago, and whose members I just adore as individuals. So I'm really happy to see you moving into this space and joining us from wherever you are today. I'm really just curious, actually, if I could launch a quick poll to begin that asks you where you're calling in from today. In the past, we've had folks, of course, from around the local area, as well as in BC, across Canada, internationally. And, of course, many of us are social distancing and in various configurations of home and life. So it looks like there's quite a few folks who are here from the Vancouver area. Thank you and welcome to our international guests, and also welcome to folks tuning in from a sock drawer or similar. I myself am broadcasting from the top of a sock drawer in a small apartment at the foot of Main Street, which is not far from CERi's headquarters at 312 Main in Vancouver, BC. I recognize this as the unceded Indigenous homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and I'm committed to seeing these homelands returned or compensated for. As we begin a conversation about cultural sensitivity and its adjacency and linkages to the work of decolonization, to racial justice, to social justice, I invite everyone here to hold compassionate space for reckoning with and acknowledging our individual and collective entanglements in colonial systems. To me, this work is very much about doing what we can, where we can, big and small, to dismantle those systems. And this is part of how and why CERi is here at SFU. We're a research unit that recently celebrated its 1-year anniversary, and we exist to play a small role in what is the ongoing collective work of shifting power. CERi strives to embody this in our programs, and particularly the way that research is done. We've recently released a handbook for community engaged research, and the handbook is designed to help organizations gain a practical understanding of community engaged research, also sometimes referred to as CER. It provides a guiding framework for developing a CER project, and it's been created with community serving organizations like nonprofits and service agencies in mind, but it might also be useful for students, early career researchers, anyone curious about using research to advance community interests, and Tyne has helpfully shared that link in the chat. Our next slide here provides an overview of what we'll be doing together in today's session. So today, this is just one part of the collective wisdom that we're sharing in a monthly webinar series that runs to June. It takes place on the third Wednesday of every month, roughly until June 2021. And our hope with Remaking the Table is that this series can function as a meaningful space for people to come together and think together to address some of the ongoing challenges of work in research contexts, and really welcome the fact that this has been a very interdisciplinary space of people meeting and interacting with each other from a whole number of different communities. There are, of course, a number of folks here who work in post-secondary spaces, and also people who work in nonprofits, in public health, mental health, in municipal governance, in Indigenous communities, and in immigrant serving communities, et cetera. So just a really wide range of knowledge and expertise here that I'm really eager to hear about and learn from as well. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, particularly as we move into the 1-year anniversary of a global health crisis and pandemic that has brought so many pressing issues to light, particularly racism, white supremacy, the need for racial justice and equity. And this is super complex, nuanced work. Obviously, within this small frame that we have to work with today, we're going to get up some of the solutions, some of the ways forward, but obviously this is a forever conversation. So I'm really hopeful that today's session will productively complexify and bring some nuance to an ongoing space of learning about issues related to cultural sensitivity and racial equity. thinking about the expertise that you bring into this room, about the questions that you have, and any reflections that you'd like to share with each other. I really welcome you doing that and sharing that either in the chat box here on Zoom. We've also created a digital space in which you can share your expertise and perspectives, reflections. It's a platform called Padlet, which I'm just sharing in the chat right now. And you can access it via this link. When you look at the page on Padlet, you can use the circular fuchsia button at the bottom right corner of the page to add a new post onto Padlet. You'll see that it's a scrolling page. So at the top of the page, we just invite folks to introduce themselves if they wish to. And as they scroll down, they can find more spaces to interact, particularly around inviting you to voice some of your curiosities around this work, best practices, sharing resources for further learning, asking questions. This space will be monitored for questions as we move into a question period at about 1:30. Looking into the final slide before we move into the panel, I just wanted to briefly share with you our community agreements for today. This might be familiar to you from the Eventbrite registration page. And you'll see here that we're really striving to convene in a spirit of mutual support and respect for each other and for this work, acknowledging the very diverse learning journeys that we're all on, and the fact that within a 60-minute webinar, you're going to probably expect and have to accept non-closure in a number of these conversations, and yet, we're still striving. We're always striving to find new ways to be together. There's also some pieces around here about how this webinar is being convened. You might be familiar with webinar settings on Zoom, but you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom, which is at the bottom of your Zoom browser to ask questions. You can also use Padlet from that link. And for those who are curious about sharing this with folks who aren't able to join us live today, this is going to be a recorded session that will be posted on CERi's website. And I've noticed that there are many comprehensive and rigorous note takers who sometimes join us in these webinars. So I just wanted to let you know that to aid that and to aid your resource collection, you can enable a live transcript in Zoom if you wish. You can also save a transcript from our session. And the CERi team will be sending links to any resources that are named in this session in an email following the event. So if you're having trouble keeping up with both what's going on in this window as well as in the Padlet window, you can rest assured that we'll be doing our best to share resources with folks later on. So I'll have you end these slides right now, and I'm just really excited to move into the space of introducing our guests. I'm really, really excited for you to meet the founders of Bảo Vệ Collective. This is a group of grassroots community organizers working to empower Vietnamese youth to create equitable communities. The collective began in late March 2020 during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and they launched bilingual Vietnamese and English resources on federally funded financial aid programs like employment insurance and the Canadian Emergency Response Benefits. As I said earlier, I had the real pleasure of witnessing the work of the collective evolve and grow since its founding, and I deeply admire the thoughtful, the nuance, and particularly open-minded approach to the work that the members bring. So to me, they really embody a spirit of meeting people where they are, while engaging in an ongoing journey of learning for themselves and self-reflection in this work, which I so admire. So I'd like to invite the members of Bảo Vệ Collective to come onto camera into the webinar space now. Welcome all of you. So you'll see in people's names, our guests today are Mimi Nguyen, Evie Trong, Kathy Tai, and I'll introduce each of them briefly here. Mimi Nguyen's history with the diasporas has consistently pulled her into community work that's been geared towards what she has later learned to be reconciliation with intergenerational trauma. After being heavily involved in previous Vietnamese youth organizations, she expanded her work to visual storytelling, where one of her film projects about the fraught political identities in Vietnamese diasporic communities, created with friend and colleague Kathy Tai, who's also here, was featured locally at the Vancouver Asian Film Festival, internationally at the Vietnamese Film Festival in LA. And while navigating through the creative world in film and marketing, she's worked as a community consultant on behalf of the City of Vancouver to facilitate bylaw changes for equitable outcomes. Now she's the COVID-19 project lead with Bảo Vệ Collective, working alongside co-founders Kathy Tai and Evie Trong. I'm also really pleased to introduce Evie. Evie Trong is a second-generation Vietnamese settler residing and working on the lands of the three title-holding nations, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh, as well as the lands of the Kikite First Nations. She is the Community and Public Engagement Coordinator of Bảo Vệ Collective, which she co-founded with her two friends and colleagues, Mimi and Kathy. Her work includes, but is not exclusive to, learning rules and social codes in order to bend, break, and scheme up new ways of working and imagining collective futures. Passionate about information justice, digital literacy, and community-centered research, she's currently pursuing her Master's of Library and Information Sciences at the University of British Columbia. She hopes to deepen her research on topics that center the experiences of racialized immigrant communities and digital equity. And last but not least, Kathy Tai. Kathy describes themselves as a word-juggling color wizard, and I deeply appreciate their artistry and the beautiful communication design that they have lent to BBC and many other spheres of work and life. Kathy is also a second-generation Vietnamese person who resides and works where their parents took refuge on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, Stalo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Kikite First Nations. Kathy's work has always, in one way or another, involved the written and or spoken word, as well as the aesthetics that frame and complement them. Whether they're focusing their lens on an oral history project, designing a community publication, or in the case of Bảo Vệ Collective, specializing in design and communications, working as a co-founder with Mimi and Evie, Kathy works with inclusion and community in mind. So welcome all of you. Thank you so much for joining us in this space. I wish that the room was just clapping for you right now. And this is a strange dystopia that we're living in. But as we move into this conversation, I wanted to start by building a little bit of a framework about what cultural sensitivity is, what it aims to do, and also draw attention potentially to the limits of the way that we use language to describe this work. And so I wanted to begin with this framing about cultural sensitivity by a group called Bronx Partners for Health Communities, which is a public health organization in New York City. And I'm just referring to a cultural sensitivity workshop that they provide to people that I've linked in the chat here. And they talk about how cultural sensitivity is about being aware of cultural differences and similarities between people, being aware that those differences exist without assigning them a value. They're neither positive or negative, good or bad, right or wrong. However, cultural differences and similarities exist between people exist, and they have an effect on values, learning, and behavior. Cultural sensitivity refers to a set of skills that allows you to understand, learn about, and work with people whose cultural background is not the same as your own. And I'm sure, many folks in this room, including yourselves, might have pieces to add or revise to this living discussion about cultural sensitivity and how it lives and breathes in different contexts. And I'm really curious, hearing from you now about where the energy is for culturally sensitive work as you're seeing it and experiencing it at the moment. And I really welcome either of you to step forward with some speaking to that question.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank you, everybody, for having us to have this discussion today. What I do appreciate with how cultural sensitivity is being framed in this discussion is that cultural differences and similarities are neither positive or negative because nothing is really inherently one or another. However, what is true is the fact that some communities are given more visibility than others. And when visibility and having a voice to being heard, that is a privilege and a power. So when a power, something to know about power is that it just doesn't magically manifest by itself. It's a result of historical influences and the relationships that communities create when they first came into contact with one another. So cultural sensitivity work, or the ability to actually acknowledge the difference, is important because you have to be aware of those historical relationships that you have with other communities. And when more than one community are working together, there is a power dynamic that needs to be acknowledged. An acknowledgement that this power exists and it's there because it came at the expense of others. And when communities are in a position of power, they're privileged enough not to see the gaps or inequalities of interaction experienced by more underserved communities or marginalized communities, or at least not to see it in the extent of how these communities with less powers feel. So as a result, the energy that really goes into cultural sensitivity work falls disproportionately on those with less visibility. And because they need to ask to be seen, they need to ask for others to be educated and be more mindful of those interactions. And even if privileged communities come forward and very willingly want to fill that gap, I think that sometimes we see that sometimes these communities fail to understand how to really reflect on the ways in which their position affects other communities. And so unfortunately, the education for cultural sensitivity work is often carried by these more marginalized communities. If we want to think about it in real life situations, there's a power dynamic between white and BIPOC communities. And of course, historically, and even now, BIPOC communities carry that weight of cultural sensitivity work and education. But it's also important to know that not all powers and inequalities are weighted in the same way, especially in BIPOC communities. So even when other BIPOC communities work together, there's still a power dynamic that needs to be aware and that needs to be acknowledged and recognized. And, there's still so much work that needs to be done in this area.
Yeah, definitely. To add to what you're saying, Mimi, in every circumstance when there's collaboration, there's going to be power dynamics at play, and working on BVC has really allowed us to see that firsthand. So organizations and institutions have reached out to us with a desire to better understand and serve their local communities. And that might be a moral goal or a desire for better optics to look good. And it might also be something that's financially beneficial. And wanting all of these things isn't necessarily wrong, though it is uncomfortable to admit. And it's kind of the way of a capitalistic society that one thing will influence the other. But when you're in a position of power, you have to be aware of your particular balance of motivations and be honest about that in order to do the work correctly. So when a smaller or emerging group partners with a well-known institution or governmental body, those involved with the more powerful party, especially if they're the ones in charge, need to be able to reconcile with the desire to make it about themselves, how they're doing really well because they have the privilege to offer a platform. Attention should be paid to how they frame those they work with and the communities they want to support. At the end of the day, will this work actually serve the community? Will it empower small organizations? Or will good optics and financial gain for the more powerful party ultimately outweigh the benefits for the community? It's good to remind ourselves that people are not ornamental, they're not chess pieces. People are the core of this work. Also, people can tell, and I think this will become increasingly true as time goes on and sensitive messaging becomes more familiar, that when actions are taken towards culturally sensitive work are inauthentic, people are going to know. And if you're superficially doing this work, it's going to become evident, and there are consequences to that.
I just want to again say thank you, Kathy, for your last point on the fact that people aren't ornamental, that we need to be genuine in this work. And I think it's an important reminder for us all in this room to really think about what are the motivations for the work that we do. So when we were approached to have this conversation today about cultural sensitivity, I had to take a time to take a step back and look at the work that we've done in the last little while. And I'm not going to lie, it's quite difficult to quantify this work under the lens of cultural sensitivity in a lot of ways, primarily because racialized people are marked a certain way culturally and politically, because also cultural sensitivity is a very weird way to box in my lived experiences. And I know that a lot of people feel the same way, where we don't want to be fulfilling quotas. And what I mean is that if we approach justice or equity work only through the lens of being culturally sensitive, then I question whether or not we'll actually be able to reach a point where our communities are liberated and well-funded and well-resourced, and that we'll stop being treated as a diversity quota, which has happened all too much. Our models of work, whether they are nonprofits or are just within or not, are just within a system of capitalism, and it often situates marginalized people in economic conditions where resources and our sense of security will always feel scarce. It's heartbreaking to witness, as much as it is exploitative, mentally exhausting, and forces people to adopt a survival mentality. When the lockdowns first started, I think everyone was worried about how it would plan out, if people would have enough means to get through this. What was really heartbreaking, though, what was really heartbreaking to witness, though, was that there were so many people who couldn't take time off work, who needed to go to work and risk themselves and their families because of a lack of resources, income, or even a network of community to rely on. These people are the people who, like my parents, are janitors and custodians. And they are people who work in our grocery stores, who time after time are not seen as essential workers, although they've been working through this whole entire lockdown. This pandemic has really brought out social and economic inequalities that we know have been long-standing issues. So being culturally sensitive now at this moment is a little bit frustrating. I know it means well, but it bears repeating that this is not anything new to marginalized communities, and it's being highlighted tenfold. I think we're entering a space where everything is uncomfortable, and it should be, because these are things that we've long needed to reckon with, and because we need to ask ourselves what our responsibility to each other is, to other communities, to the people around us, to the people who are in our neighborhoods. So when BVC first released, it was interesting and a little bit weird to get the kind of public attention that we did receive. And I mean, like, not to get me wrong, it was good because that meant that it helped us get the word out to different audiences. And it called attention to language justice for those who didn't realize it was a social issue. But I found that a lot of people framed our work as being resilient. And I want to really hold space today for us to really think critically about what resilience means and why we even have to be resilient in the first place. That word is a very pervasive tool that enables scarcity and convinces us that these conditions are normal and worthy of praise. So I want to be skeptical of how that word is utilized. And as I was talking to Mimi and Kathy about this, and as we were thinking through this and recalling the ways that we've grown as a collective, I remember that there was this one time where, for a media press release, because we were collaborating with a larger institution, they labeled us as the daughters of refugees in this press release. And it hit the three of us in a really weird way, because our work was just considered at that point to them as filial piety by this large institution. So, like, yes, the work at its core was to service our communities, but it reminded me that it was much easier for the public to digest this idea that we were just three little ladies doing nice work, than it is to actually reckon with how many communities are suffering during this time. So what really worries me about this moment for cultural sensitivity is that while there's energy for this work to happen, I wonder if people will actually care about these issues for the long term. Vaccines are rolling out, and I think that's a really great thing. But I worry that once quote unquote things go back to normal, we'll think that, anti-Black racism will end, that the structures of colonialism are purely theoretical, that anti-Asian violence doesn't exist. And that economic insecurity is a personal failure rather than a systems failure.
Thank you. I think that there's much to reflect on, even within the problematic framing of these discussions. The label cultural sensitivity is insufficient to speak for and account for the racist society that we are living in, and the ways in which racialized communities that also intersect with economic and social injustice have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and by other social inequities. And I really appreciate what you're saying about this kind of resiliency culture enabling a simultaneous culture of scarcity, and the importance of taking this moment beyond what often lands down as optical allyship, and really trying to connect the dots between intention and impact. I also want to remind folks in this room and the audience, you're very welcome regarding questions that we're going to turn to questions from the audience in just a few minutes. And in that space too, I want to kind of speak through the imperfection of just asking a question. I'd love to hear reflections from folks if they have them. Sometimes an addition to this conversation doesn't necessarily come in the form of a question, but maybe it comes in the form of a space that you'd like to see for further exploration. Before we do that, though, I'd be really curious, and I really appreciate the challenges that you've laid out around this work and around this moment. I'm curious about any possible horizons for change that you see in this work, particularly around the kinds of questions that you would invite folks to ask of themselves and each other in order to facilitate more reflective, productive inner work. If there are, particular groups or organizations or resources that you feel that are doing this work particularly well, what could be learned from them?
Yeah, I think that through this discussion, we've said that cultural sensitivity work sometimes it often falls at the expense of BIPOC folks, underserved communities. But first of all, cultural sensitivity is not inherently a BIPOC issue. Cultural sensitivity work is about power. And so when we think about cultural sensitivity, when placed into practice, we need to think about the actual interactions that are involved. How we think about how should you interact with communities that are different than yours. And this implies that there is a right or a wrong way to do the interaction or the actual work, that there's a checklist, a formula, or a land acknowledgement that can be used across all communities. But that's a big misconception. All communities, again, hold different weights of power. We all have different relationships with one another. Therefore, our experiences and our inequalities are different than others. So it's really important to take the time to be self-reflective of your position in the relationships formed with other people, the institutions that you're involved when equitable work needs to be delivered. But again, self-reflection is only just the beginning for equitable outcomes. While we can encourage everybody to change how you think and how you should carry yourself when engaging with different communities, it's also important to acknowledge that, inequalities are a result of institutional and systemic racism, and that racism runs fairly deep. So, some institutions, we just need to also acknowledge that some of them are built in a way for this work to fail. So self-reflection, again, is just scratching the surface, and so much more work needs to be done. And for those who are really earnestly working towards equity within specific institutions, I think it's also very important to be aware of how and where that failure for equity work can break down in that process.
Yeah, I think just really quickly to add that while so much of this is in our heads, it's also important while you're doing this to stay attuned to your feelings and ask yourself, am I hesitant at the moment? Am I afraid? And of what and why? What biases or fears are inhibiting me from truly listening and responding to a different point of view?
I think I'll just like add on to like this question, and then also to like what Mimi and Kathy are saying too. And especially like Mimi, thank you for saying like just acknowledging that power is so much at play when we do this kind of work. And like that's also what I want to like, I urge people to ask themselves as well, is like what is power that you hold, and like what are you doing with that? And I think admitting to having a relationship to power can be very difficult and really uncomfortable, but I think it's really important that we self-reflect a lot about like how are we holding power and how are we empowering communities, because those are two different things. And I think that sometimes they become so synonymous with each other that we lose sight of the work that we're actually doing. So again, just even within the three of us, Mimi, Kathy, and I, we can't ever speak for the Vietnamese community. I mean, the Vietnamese community has long existed before BBC happened anyway, and will always be here, whether or not BBC is a thing. But it's important that, at the very beginning, we were looking at federal financial aid programs. And at the very core of our first project, we were thinking about, okay, how do we actually get people within our communities to apply for these funds? And it's because, Mimi, Kathy, and I were university educated. We speak English. We know how to navigate these systems. And these are points of privileges that we have in the work that we do. But my hope is that we are never seen as like the gatekeepers of how to do equity work within our communities, because again, Vietnamese aunties are going to exist with or without us.
Reflecting so much on what you're saying, particularly around, I wish I could I've been writing down many of your quotes because they're so important for further reflection, and particularly the question about how are we holding power? How are we empowering communities? And Kathy's questions about what the questions that we can ask ourselves to consider our own complicity and our own entanglements within these systems. There's a question related to this from a group called the Feminist Campaign School, who is here in this panel right now, and they say I'm thinking about how government engages with racialized and marginalized communities. It's often extractive and reads as tokenizing. In the long run, it may contribute to, in the long run, it may contribute to disenfranchisement. Do you have thoughts or examples of ways that it could be done better and power could be shared?
I think that's a great question, because I think in the work that we've done with BBC, it's something that we consistently ask ourselves. I think the best way, or of course, I think we're also working towards what cultural sensitivity work should look like. And I don't think that there is a perfect model for it. And again, like what we've said, our interactions with different communities, those relationships look different. So I don't think there is going to be one set model that anybody can follow and can be applied across everybody. But one thing that we can think about is invest in people rather than in projects. Because at the end of the day, it's the people that you need to serve. It's the people that need to be served. And if the project just exists for, sorry to say, clout, then I really don't think that's, we're not heading in the right direction. That's not equitable.
I'm also going to follow up this question as well, just because Kathy's earlier answer was, I think, really apt in terms of like, well, we have to be in tune to our own emotions and our own feelings about the kind of work that we're doing, because I think that we need to preserve an inner world of our communities and how we feel in our communities, because the goal is not to assimilate into institutions or bureaucratic systems. Our goal is to not replicate white supremacy and these longstanding issues and institutions that we know aren't serving us. And so, in one end, the work that we do, there's a limitation to that in terms of like how it serves us and what it can actually mobilize and move forward. But then at the same time, I think about this a lot in terms of preserving our inner worlds and how, again, we find joy in the work that we do, or the joy that we find in each other within our communities. It's not like the perfect answer to that question, but it's definitely what I'm thinking through with that question.
And that question about the long term, and sorry, Kathy, I'd love for you to jump in.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to add, like, just as individuals should be aware of, cultural sensitivity, the organizations, institutions, or governmental bodies should also be aware of its own standing historically and presently, how it operates and what it's asking of smaller orgs and communities, and to, hold itself accountable to enacting necessary changes.
So important. I think that those pieces around how, both how to do it and how to do this long term is really key. A question from Padlet is from someone who identifies themselves as Kate in Toronto. Hello, Kate. How to make awareness outlive the pandemic? I had this question from the beginning, wanting the cohesion that arose and often arises in response to a calamity that affects everyone. I think that there's something really interesting here about potentially an extension of some of your reflections around the relationships at the core of this work, the joy that is part of those relationships, and what that creates in terms of long possibilities for ongoing community, ongoing work.
I think I'll jump into this question a little bit. And again, Mimi, Kathy, interrupt me if need be. But I think it's so interesting because, like, when BVC first started, we were in a group chat and we were kind of scrambling and we're like, okay, what needs to be done? How do we respond? And it was just like our immediate impulse to wanting to help and do what we can in our community. And like we three of us have been involved in community organizing things before. And so we wanted to, again, do something concerning our community. And that felt more specific to us and our identity, because again, like in the previous work that we've done, it's mainly been within and in Chinatown, but we wanted to do something that was more specifically for the Vietnamese community. And I think what's really interesting now is that we're trying to find our footing in how to do this a little bit longer or a little bit more, because we're seeing how we want to sustain the health of our community. That, even though this project was, I think, we've done it really well, there's so much more work that needs to happen. And I think there's a lot of interest from, again, other community organizations and institutions to collaborate. But at the same time, we don't want to be like the token Vietnamese group. So we're still trying to like figure out a space for us to really do the work that we want to do with Vietnamese youth, with civic engagement. And we're still parsing through what that could look like for us. Like, one of the things that the three of us have been really open about is that we don't function as a nonprofit. Well, because we're not an official nonprofit organization. And so, but we do rely on our partnerships with other organizations within the community. And like, that could be exciting because it allows us to have more freedom in the work that we want to imagine for ourselves. But it's also really tricky because that's not how you get funding. And that's also like a huge part of like sustaining the work that we want to do. So I think we're at a time where BBC is transitioning a lot, and we're making a lot of changes of what it could look like long term. But again, we're like hitting our first year anniversary really soon, and it's just a time where we're doing a lot of self-reflection and a lot of thinking back of like what are the lessons we've learned in the past year. I don't know if Mimi and Kathy wanna.
I think what you said was great. And I think that when it comes, circling back to cultural sensitivity work and how it disproportionately falls on underserved communities, and we feel that pressure and work more during the pandemic, because like what Evie and Kathy had mentioned earlier, that what happens when the pandemic is over? Will anybody care about the work that we do? And so there's a lot of feeling of burnout. And what does this work look like after, when this phenomenon, ends? It doesn't end for us. And I think that the answer in the society that we live in is money. Like, you need to give us money so we can sustain the work that we do.
Yeah, to pick up on that, burnout is such a big deal. And I think a more sustainable method to ease burnout is that, we need to see a response, to see change and support, have some of that extra weight carried elsewhere. And ultimately, see parts of the work picked up by other organizations or governmental bodies, or to be given, the necessary resources and funding to continue doing the work. Because, aside from all the things we can do to take care of ourselves, there has to be more than just that.
I also wanted to add on to that and say that, the work that is being done to fill in this gap for cultural sensitivity work is already being done, and most often being done for free. So that also adds on to the burnout.
So there are real multitudes to this. And I think, and I'd like to close just in acknowledgement of another reflection that was shared on Padlet about, this person asking, is it about learning and being better, or moving aside and giving up privileged positions? I think it sounds like it's about all of those things. It's never an either or. I think that part of the work, and what I'm hearing from you, is really about the deep work of moving beyond the binaries that we have been taught to exist within, and also that trap us, and that serve not to liberate us. And I, there's so much here, particularly around burnout, the exhaustion of this work. Many people in this room, I'm sure, are exhausted at the moment. And I hope that any audience members who are here, I'm grateful for your attending, because, this era of Zoom is just really, it's really tiring. Thinking about how do we move through that together? How do we carry each other in a different way? I would love to hear a really brief closing reflection from you. Perhaps this has to do with the kind of community care or the kind of repair work that might be part of this conversation. Maybe it's about something else. I'd love to begin with a brief 3-minute closing with Kathy, then Evie, and then Mimi.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. At the beginning of this discussion, you asked us where the energy is for culturally sensitive work right now. And I'd like to add, all systems go, fire on all cylinders, folks. We should be finding the energy for culturally sensitive work on all fronts, not just in a community organizing context. Though we should keep in mind the risk of doing anything hastily without having conversations, without taking the time to learn how to be effective and do culturally sensitive work effectively, and really taking the time to sit with our own biases and motivations. There is a risk of doing this work in a superficial manner, like I had mentioned, and to point to a hot button issue in popular media discourse and to leave you with a recommendation. I've been listening to a new podcast series by Reply All. It's called The Test Kitchen, which is an investigation and breakdown of the online reckoning of Bon Appetit, owned by Condé Nast. And for those unfamiliar, it might be one of the biggest examples of how a well-loved brand was completely destroyed by its lack of cultural sensitivity. After receiving backlash for racism and underpaying BIPOC staff, their editor-in-chief had to resign, and the company went silent for a bit before returning with a new diverse cast for their online videos. And the podcast hasn't touched on this yet, but without an apology, a demonstration of how they're repairing the damage already done to their previous staff, or transparent examples of how they'll do better in the future, people hated the comeback. Like, you can check the like to dislike ratio. It's pretty awful. It felt superficial to everyone, like they were using diversity and a newfound cultural sensitivity as a shield in order to continue making money. And the podcast is currently digging into the inception of BA to reveal like how toxic its company culture has been for years. And when you're listening, I don't think you can help but draw connections between this particular company and how the majority of businesses and big institutions operate. And hearing about these experiences in particular, even through like a mildly informed lens, I think it becomes glaringly obvious why everyone should find the energy to do culturally sensitive work.
I'm going to second Kathy and say that the podcast is pretty good. But I'll go in and just say that just thinking about like reflecting and thinking about VVC's like upcoming 1-year anniversary, and it's just stunning to me to know that we've made it 1 year. But I just want to admit very publicly, like, this work is hard and I still struggle with navigating this work. And I think it's hard because I want people to care, but I can't always teach people that. But I feel like I have to at least try. Back in the really early days, when the three of us were in a newspaper article, I remember we got a comment from someone that told us that if our people wanted help, that we needed to learn English. And like, what do you even do with that? Like, how do you even respond? Because there are some people who have really made up their minds that it is our personal failing. And whenever I do hear comments like that, I get angry, but I'm also tired of being angry. And it just makes me feel really gutted to be in an environment where we think that resources are scarce, or that we don't deserve it, or there's something that is inherently a personal failing on our end. And it's just hard. But, you know, like, with that said, also, some of the hardest conversations that I've had in the last year was doing a lot of internal reflecting at like what it means to be Vietnamese, what it means to be a part of like this Asian community, this like very broad monolithic Asian community. And something that I kind of want to bring up too, especially at the height of like what we're facing right now within Asian American communities and anti-Asian violence, is that, you know, with that being said, there's also the fact that we need to be in solidarity with other communities as well. And I really want to reflect back to like this conversation that I had with my parents about the Black Lives Matter movement, and also anti-Black racism that is really prevalent in Asian communities. It's really hard to have these conversations because, like, where do you even begin? But you have to begin somewhere. How do you even translate these things into Vietnamese? How do you even have these conversations when there are so many defense mechanisms built in within our own communities that are in place and that are also in play with how we think about ourselves in relationship to other people? Again, I think it's like this survival mentality where you think that if you work hard enough, then you can be liberated. And that's something that I think is really strong in Asian communities. But we also know that that current system is not working, and we know that it's exploitative. So it's really hard for So I really think that it's our individual responsibility to have these discussions around what community organizing work can look like. And it's not just about our survival over another community, but to think about the conditions of power that are at play. So this is all to say that I'm still struggling with how to have these conversations with people within our own community, with the people that you care about, the people that you want to see do better. We really have to hold down these conversations. And I sometimes find that in organizing spaces or in any space, really, it can be very intense and obsessed with getting things right the first time around. And it could be really hostile. It could be a really hostile environment to learn. But I really urge people that the hard conversations are worth having and being persistent on. We need to be accountable, but we also need to be caring and compassionate with where people are at. And it's because at the very core of the work that we do, or what we aspire to do, is that we believe people can do better, that we can actually learn how to share resources and to build an environment where people can actually thrive instead of just having to feel like everything is scarce or that we have to maintain this survivor mentality. So I think I'll leave my final comments with that.
Thank you, and Kathy, for sharing your thoughts on that. And I just wanted to tie in with everything that we've discussed today. And what I've realized in our work, just within our communities and working with other communities, is that communities can't grow when they're not given the opportunity to recognize themselves. So in today's discussion, cultural sensitivity is seen as a method for building equity. It's aimed at equalizing power and lifting underserved communities, but the work and the focus shouldn't be on the underserved communities. It's not about how to fill in the gap. It's about why that gap exists in the first place. It's about repositioning how people in power think about their history and relationship with different communities. So a question that people can think and ask is, how does you being in this shared space affect other people involved? Because the relationship that you have with people should inform the way that you interact with people. So also, as mentioned earlier before, all communities hold different weights of power. We all have different, we all experience inequalities differently from one another. And there's a lot of diversity within communities. So while, other communities of power need to self-reflect, we also need to understand that all communities have inner work that needs to be done. And that includes other BIPOC communities. Cultural sensitivity work needs to be done when everybody does the work. So less visible and underserved communities need to be given the space and resources to recognize their own needs as well. And, we see this a lot in inter-community work when allies want to extend a hand and lift other communities by providing shared spaces and shared learning opportunities. But what underserved communities really need are the resources, money for their own spaces, for their own learning, so that when the time comes, they know exactly what their asks are. And then we can effectively work together towards sustainable and equitable outcomes.
Thank you so much, all of you, for these really helpful reflections. This leaves us with so much to continue thinking about and unpacking and acting on. Particularly, I think that the investigation of power that you are surfacing in this conversation is so crucial. We had, a final question about the limits of the word or the phrase cultural sensitivity, which I agree with. And I think here, in your discussion, you've demonstrated that this requires, the phrase is insufficient to describe the broad investigation of power and privilege and how we can enact anti-racism in all of our work. That is so core to some of the disentanglement. So Mimi and Kathy and Evie, I thank you all so much for joining us today. Please feel welcome to learn more about Bảo Vệ Collective through the link that Tyne had helpfully posted in the chat, and we really wish you very good things in the future of this work, and particularly in the sustained and joyful future of this work, which I think is so central as well. So we also just want to thank you on behalf of CERi for joining us, and we'll move into our last thank you slide here. If you want to get in touch with us in other ways, our channels are here below, and we'll look forward to our future and next step in this webinar series, which looks at decolonizing practices, unsettling the work, and particularly how to bring joy and delight into all of this. This is happening on March 17th next month. So, but we'll be in touch with you before then. So I hope that everybody has a great day and take good care. Bye.